their own minds. In Othello, the divergences are significant, as are indeed the different motivations for action across a range of dramatis personae. The play begins in the middle of a conversation between Roderigo and Iago. We don't yet know what Rodrigo's deictic "this" refers to. He says, "I take it much unkindly that thou, Iago, who hast my purse, as if the strings were thine, should know of this." As a way of justifying himself, Iago reveals that he's been passed over for promotion in favour of a great arithmetician, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine. Now, this is the first of a number of motives for Iago's secret animosity to Othello. Iago will follow him to serve my turn upon him. And even more, he says, in following him, I follow but myself. Heaven is my judge, not I, for love and duty, but seeming so for my peculiar end. For when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart, in compliment extern, 'tis not long after, but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve for doors to peck at. I am not what I am. That's a phrase that will echo right the way down throughout this play and can be applied, of course, to the eponymous hero. He is not what he is. Iago's candor here is misleading in that it doesn't occur to Roderigo to apply what he says to his own situation. Iago's rank is that of ensign, one who carries the military flag. But this representation is, we might say, skin deep. Later, after having disquieted Brabantio, Desdemona's father, and having bad-mouthed Othello, he departs with the words, I must show out a flag and sign of love, which is indeed but sign. Iago's resentment fuels a racism that has the capacity to dehumanize the play's eponymous tragic hero. Othello, according to this negative valuation, is an old black ram who is tupping your white ewe. And Brabantio is urged to awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. Initially, Brabantio resists this challenge, but after Roderigo's reinforcement of Iago's sentiments, he reveals that this accident is not unlike my dream. Belief of it oppresses me already. Now, at the heart of Venice, there's a patriarchal fear of loss that will fuel Iago's revenge against Othello, but that also infects its dream world. Part of Iago's strategy is that he incites others to act, thereby drawing them into a complex web of fears and motivations in which fantasy and reality collide. There's been much speculation about Iago's motivation since Coleridge pronounced that it was, quote, motiveless malignity. The fact is that aside from his initial motivation, which is jealousy of Cassio's professional success and a hostility towards Othello, he adduces others. For example, in the soliloquy in which he reveals his plot to discredit Cassio, in part by imputing motives that will discredit Cassio's dealing with Desdemona, he also discloses other motives. He says, now I do love her too, not out of absolute lust, though peradventure I stand accountant for as great a sin, but partly led to diet my revenge, for that I do suspect the lusty Moor has leapt into my seat, the thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw at my innards, and nothing can or shall content my soul till I am even with him, wife for wife. Now his suspicion also extends to Cassio in this respect. What Iago stimulates in Brabantio and what will later provoke in Othello is a jealousy so strong that judgment cannot cure, that is rooted in the patriarchal loss of possession, whether it be a father's loss of control over his daughter or a husband's loss of control over his wife. In the case of Brabantio, the loss proves to be deadly, but it will not provoke revenge. Similarly, in Cassio's case, the fall from favor is disquieting, but does not produce an irrational backlash. But in the case of Othello, of Iago's real target, Othello, The latter is deceived into replicating the contours of his ensign's behaviour. The process is slow, and in the case of Brabantio and Cassio, different facets of Iago's complex net of entrapment are revealed. By Act 3, Scene 3, Iago is ready to tackle Othello. The entire strategy is dependent upon Othello's assessment of Iago. I know, he says, thou'rt full of love and honesty. But it's also dependent upon Iago's assessment of Othello's openness. It's ironical that just as there is a discrepancy between Iago's inner life and outward signs that he manipulates, so with Othello, the inner man is noble, whereas his black appearance is associated in Venice with the devil. This split in the persona of the tragic hero is there from the beginning and is part of a larger structure whereby, as audience, we're forced to process contradictory signs. Now, in the earlier play, which is linked to Othello, it's the other Venetian play, The Merchant of Venice, a possible misogynistic marriage between Portia and Morocco is summarily rejected, although in the play, generally, the target is the figure of Shylock, the Jew, whom Venetian law coerces into conformity. Anti-Semitism is one facet of Venice's behavior, and in Othello, racism is its counterpart. In the earlier play, the Jew outlines the similarities between himself and his Venetian adversaries. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as the Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If a Jew wrong a Christian, what's his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be? By Christian example? Why? Revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. Now, unlike in Hamlet, that interrogates the ethics of revenge, Shakespeare's Venetian plays expose a series of contradictions that reside at the heart of Republican Venice, a state that was popularly thought to dispense with hierarchies and to welcome strangers. Shylock, like Othello, is a stranger in Venice, and in both cases, their presence releases a virulent anti-Semitism and racism, both of which emerge as strangers adopt Venetian values. Both Shylock and Othello are hybrid figures, and neither is fully assimilated into Venice's structures, though both are necessary for the Republic's efficient functioning. Shylock supplies the money for Venetian economic enterprise, and Othello is the protector of the state against the barbarian, i.e. Turkish aggression. In both plays, revenge is a powerful subterranean force that has both a quasi-legal foundation and is capable of generating an illusory form of justice. Shylock's bond is, by his own definition, a form of revenge, though it seeks to avail itself of the law, whereas what Othello does is to usurp the law as the governor of Cyprus on a pretext for which the proof is flimsy. In doing so, Othello enacts the logic of Shylock, but in doing so, he is motivated by the patriarchal fear of loss of possession that has already afflicted both Brabantio and, in a professional sense, Cassio, and the overwhelming of judgment by emotion that the different contours of this fear elicits. Like Brabantio earlier, Othello's reasoning begins from conclusions and is deductive rather than inductive. He begins from the assumption that Iago's love and honesty are substantive, and that therefore his hesitations must point to a deep emotional disturbance that he's reluctant to display openly. He says, "And for I know thou'rt full of love and honesty, and waste thy words before thou givest them breath. Therefore these stops of thine affright me the more. For such things in a false disloyal knave are tricks of custom, but in a man that's just, they're close delations working from the heart that passion cannot rule. Now the irony here is that the delations to which Othello refers are in Iago's case a series of deeper emotions that violate the very love and honesty to which Othello appeals. Brabantio's much earlier conclusion, emanating from the mere absence of Desdemona, that it is too true and evil gone she is here replicated as Othello is manipulated into a series of conclusions prompted only by the flimsiest kind of circumstantial evidence. But we should be careful here. Othello is not in any straightforward sense naive. He knows what disloyalty and dishonesty are, and how they reveal themselves rhetorically. He does not, however, suspect his ensign, nor does he have second thoughts about the initial appointment of Cassio. Indeed, he only regrets that appointment after Cassio has disgraced himself in Cyprus. And even then, he doesn't know the full story, since the narrative at this point, as indeed elsewhere in the play, is carefully manipulated by Iago. Indeed, so audacious is Iago's strategy that he can tell Othello the truth about himself without arousing suspicion, as indeed he had done with Rodrigo much earlier. Iago's withholding of his own thoughts is regarded by Othello as a violation of friendship. Thou dost conspire against thy friend Iago, but if thou thinkst him wrong, and makest his ear a stranger to thy thoughts. But this is Iago's response. I do beseech you, though I perchance am vicious in my guess, as I confess it is my nature's plague to spy into the abuses, and of my jealous shapes faults that are not, that your wisdom from one that so imperfectly conceits would take no notice, nor build yourself a trouble out of his scattering and unsure observance. It were not for your quiet, nor your good, nor for my manhood, honesty, and wisdom, to let you know my thoughts. Now we can judge Iago's characterization of himself on the basis of the evidence that we as audience have accumulated. But note the context that Iago provides. He admits to jealousy and to fantasizing, but he concludes by repeating Othello's own evaluation of him. To utter his thoughts would certainly, we know, disquiet Othello, but that to do so would damage his own manhood, honesty, and wisdom is to strengthen the inference that their integrity remain intact. This apparent concern is also proleptic, in that Othello's quiet will be radically disrupted, and his manhood, honesty, and wisdom exposed to scrutiny as he acts upon what he believes to be Iago's display of honesty and friendship. The question is, what effect does all this have on Othello? Firstly, it makes him susceptible to suggestion, but others have preceded him in this. Iago's warning replicates exactly his own previously disclosed fears. Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. The cuckold lives in bliss, who certain of his fate loves not the wronger. But oh, what damning minutes tells he, or who dotes yet dotes, suspects yet strongly loves. It is Othello's openness that provides Iago with the ammunition he needs. But the focus on jealousy and cuckoldry eats deeply into the Venetian patriarchal unconscious, thereby making Othello an inheritor of Brabantio's disquiet. This is why Brabantio's dream is so important, even though we know so little about it. The deception of her father is invoked to establish a much larger pattern of deception that will be used against Desdemona. The protracted assault on Othello's consciousness and judgment provides the context for dealing with the lost handkerchief, the very piece of evidence that will be used to confirm Desdemona's alleged adultery with Cassio. Now we know the backstory to Iago's obtaining of the handkerchief, and he uses the fabricated claim that it's now in Cassio's possession to strengthen the case in Desdemona. If it be that, or any that was hers, it speaks against her with the other proofs. At this point, we have to remind ourselves that Desdemona has done nothing wrong, morally or legally, and that she has not been involved in any public display that would cast doubt on her integrity or her moral authority. Othello's response, therefore, is private, and he has no formal recourse to the law to upbraid her or indeed punish her for her alleged infidelity. Indeed, what we know to be a seriously flawed rational response to Iago's gradually accumulating circumstantial narrative turns out to release a deadly upsurge of emotion that steers Othello to revenge. Oh, that the slave had 40,000 lives. One is too poor, too weak for my revenge. Now do I see 'tis true. Look here, Iago, all my fond love thus do I blow to heaven. 'Tis gone. Arise, black vengeance, from the hollow hell. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyrannous hate. Swell bosom with thy throat, for 'tis of aspics' tongues. Now, unlike in Hamlet, where the nature of revenge is the question that opens up a host of other questions, in Othello, revenge is always private. Iago reveals part of himself to Rodrigo in order to continue milking him of money, but he keeps other aspects of his motivation from all but the audience. Othello's own revenge is secretive in that he reveals it to no one but Iago, but that revenge is embedded in other forms of classification that are subsumed into the focus on marital infidelity that the protagonist is persuaded to share with the villain. It's indeed the case, as Kim Hall has argued, that both economic and gender concerns are articulated through arbitrary distinctions in colour. We've seen how economic issues initially filter into Othello's language of love, but Iago's rhetoric expands that discourse to include questions of female promiscuity and deception, Venetian masculine concerns and fear, that Othello is persuaded to accept as motivations for his capable and wide revenge. Indeed, humble love, like the ebbing tide, relegated to an inferior status, is a position to which it is now impossible to return. And this leads to Othello's invoking of the indifferent yond marble heaven to cement in the due reverence of a sacred vow his words. Unlike in Hamlet, where the oath to remember and revenge gradually assume substantive meaning and are in a sense transformed, in Othello, the protagonist's oath has a limited contingent value that proves to be an inadequate foundation upon which to build a case. The entire fantasy to which Othello succumbs as he takes over the lurid contours of Brabantio's dream reaches into the heart of female identity in Venice. It's a conversation between the bewildered Desdemona and her serving maid Emilia about the existence of women who do abuse their husbands in such gross kind. It's the serving woman who offers a perspicacious observation on female subjectivity that matches exactly Shylock's speech in The Merchant of Venice. When asked, Emilia says, "But I do think it is their husbands' faults if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us. Or say they strike us or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet we have some revenge. Let husbands know that their wives have sense like them. They see, they smell, and have their palates, both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. Is it frailty that thus errs? It is so too. And have we not affections, desires for sport, and frailty as men have? Then let them use us well. Else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so." Now, this is an important speech that contextualizes the Venetian patriarchal perception of female subjectivity. In domestic matters, revenge is always contingent and is as much a proclivity in women as in men. What we don't expect to find is that for all its claims to superior rationality, Venetian masculinity is subject to the devastating irrationalities of professional envy, sexual jealousy, and its deadly consequence, revenge. We can see the full force of this irrationality when Othello is brought to the point of exacting revenge against Desdemona. By this time, he's trapped in a web of fantasy that Iago weaves as part of his own revenge. As he approaches the sleeping Desdemona, Othello reflects upon his cause. The cause is one that he cannot name. It's one that he cannot bring into language. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars, he says. But he's also caught between his negative image of woman and the appearance of Desdemona. Her skin is whiter than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster. But she must die, else she'll betray more men. Now, Othello was brought completely into the patriarchal myth of female infidelity, although the context that Emilia has provided for the audience still resonates. Othello is under no illusion about the magnitude of the act he's about to commit, since it will be irreparable. And he's still caught between Desdemona's appearance and what he believes will be an act of justice in killing her. I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. I have plucked the rose, when I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It must needs wither. I'll smell thee on the tree, O balmy breath that does almost persuade justice to break her sword. Once more, be thus when thou art dead, I then will kill thee and love thee after. Once more, and that's the last. Now here Othello's hybrid identity is projected onto Desdemona, who will now be the victim of a fantasy of justice. The contrast with Hamlet's predicament could not be clearer, insofar as he's charged with restoring justice to a rotten Denmark. Othello's justification is wholly illusory, and he exposes an irrational passion that by this time in the play is out of control. And yet, Othello knows what he's doing, in the same way that he earlier revealed that he knows how to distinguish the gestures of an honest man from those of a false, disloyal knave. But this is a deductive rather than an inductive knowledge. It begins from the belief, it's an inductive rather than, it begins from the belief that Iago is honest. And in this case, that Desdemona is, as a type of Venetian woman, pathologically unfaithful. Up to this point, Othello's own capacity for self-reflection has been partial. He thinks that it's his blackness and his claimed inarticulacy that's caused his alleged infidelity. Although he quickly dismisses these reasons, he says, "Happily, for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have. Or, for I am declined into the vale of years. Yet that's not much. She's gone, I am abused, and my relief must be to loathe her. O curse of marriage, that we can call these delicate creatures ours, and not their appetites." I beg your pardon. He goes on to say, into the vale of years, I'm declining into the vale of years, yet that's not much. She's gone, and I am abused. My relief must be to loathe her, or curse of marriage, etc. Sorry, I'll just said that. Now, of course, Othello's powers of persuasion are not lacking, as his narrative of the courtship of Desdemona earlier indicates. The gap here between a logic of patriarchal possession and the female appetite is prescient, since once he's disabused of his fantasy, he redirects the course of justice to himself. Or to put the matter differently, at the end of the play, Othello is a stranger to himself as he plays out the opposition between Venetian and Turk on his own body. Now, this is an unusual suicide by any Shakespearean standards. We note that Hamlet's killed by the same poison that kills his mother, Laertes, and finally Claudius, but his death is unintentional. Indeed, we might say that it's part of a larger providential design that corrects the evil in Denmark while acknowledging that the killing of Claudius takes his executioner. In Othello, just as the dynamics of revenge are different, so Othello's final act of justice displays the impossibility of his dilemma. The conflict between Venetian and Turk, between the noble hero and the black devil, is now located within the dramatic persona of the tragic protagonist himself. This makes of Othello's suicide a peculiar gesture in the direction of a retributive justice. He had thought to enact justice on Desdemona for her alleged infidelity. But like Seneca's Oedipus, he proposes himself as the model of justice, whose fate repeated performance reenacts as a kind of Senecan self-torturing. In the fifth act of Seneca's Oedipus, the tragic hero longs for repeated punishment for his crime, whereas in Shakespeare's play, the time, the place, the torture emphasizes that it's the villain Iago whose tongue will be loosened, and when his tongue is loosened, the performance will begin again. Unlike in Hamlet, where revenge is brought within the aegis of lawful retribution and distinguished clearly from anarchic wild justice, in Othello, revenge itself is the violent result of a delusion. In the later play, the representative of Venice perverts justice, but tries to reclaim some semblance of nobility by rooting the Turk out of his being. But there is more. The ending of Hamlet has the eponymous hero dying before he can give a full account. Had I but time, as this fell Sergeant Death is strict in his arrest, oh, I could tell you, but let that be. How many times have we seen that in Westerns when somebody dies before they can divulge a crucial piece of information? He tells Horatio to report me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied, but he dies in silence. The rest is silence. Horatio's account, however, is only partial, and there's a sense in which the theatre audience that have been mutes or audience to this act probably know more than Horatio does. Horatio will tell of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and false cause, and in the upshot, purposes mistook, fallen on the inventors' heads. This makes especially tantalizing Hamlet's "Oh, I could tell you." But there is a sense in which, even though the semblance of the play's ending restores a conservative order, too much has happened to render the ideology that holds it in place fragile. Fortinbras restores honour, but there's a sense in which he is less vulnerable than old Hamlet, even though he shows respect for the past. Hamlet's silence and the deaths in which he's been involved complete an action and bring revenge back into the orbit of justice, where what Horatio regards as accidents are in fact the operations of providence. Othello, on the other hand, ends differently. The murder of Desdemona is wild and cannot really be categorized within the ethos of justice. Othello's final speech, "Soft you a word or two before you go," is not, as the poet T.S. Eliot once thought, an attempt to cheer himself up. It's a report that encompasses fully the division that the tragic hero represents and externalizes. We would be mistaken if we did not think that Othello was not easily jealous, or that he was not perplexed in the extreme. When he enacts justice upon himself, this is not a replication of the example of Oedipus. Rather, he acknowledges a Manichaean split between good and evil, between the badge that for an early Jacobean spectator his blackface signifies, and the noble representation of Venetian values that Desdemona saw in his mind. At this point, we recall Iago's silence. Iago seeks to enforce others to silence, but when Othello asks him to explain himself, he says this: "Demand me nothing. What you know, you know. From this time forth, I never will speak word." But finally, having clearly been identified as this hellish villain, Iago will now be forced to speak. It is this punishment that will loosen the villain's tongue, and when he speaks again, we return to the beginning of the play. The filmmaker Orson Welles understood this, since he opened his film of the play with the ending of Shakespeare's play. There is no balance restored at the end of Othello. Both Othello and Desdemona are victims of the patriarchal fantasy that is a crucial part of the Venetian unconscious. Ludovico's response that the Odric poisoned sight is an observation that leaves the ending open. An action in the Aristotelian sense has been completed, but it is here unsatisfactory and will always be so long as in Venice human subjects are split. Here the revenge is shown to be inimical to justice, and the noble hero will always be at odds with his physical appearance, and the racism that it triggers will always cast doubt on Venetian claims to welcome strangers. Two revenge plays, then, that approach the subject in radically different but no less thoughtful ways. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sorry,
Sir, we will have the Q&A session soon.
Sorry?
Sir, we will have the question answer session soon.
Okay, yep.
Okay, yeah. Sneha?
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir, for your wonderful lecture. Now we'll be moving on to the Q&A session. For the smooth conduct of the session, me and Sam will be reading out the questions.
Okay.
We'll open today's Q&A from a question from Govindar. The question is, Sir, even after learning of the contents of the letter from Claudius to the King of England, which implies indirect injury that sanctions retributive action, Hamlet is tardy in the pursuit of revenge. And finally, when he wounds Claudius, it is the result of a sudden spurt of righteous anger at learning the deception of the king from Laertius. Is there a revenge in this text? Was Hamlet facing an ethical dilemma in seeking revenge? Even politically, going by Theban legend, the usurper seems to be right in laying claim to the throne, and the woman of the ruler ousted.
Okay, if I understand that question correct, it's a complicated question. Are you saying that, or are you wanting to argue that Hamlet's killing of Claudius at the end is in fact an act of revenge? Is that correct? Have I misunderstood?
Yeah, I think so, sir.
Okay. Well, picture the final scene, okay, where it begins with Claudius at the center. And when everything is played out, Claudius is at the margin, right? When he says, "Oh, help me, friends, I am but hurt," after he's been stabbed, he has no friends. He's isolated. And this replicates exactly the position of Hamlet at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 2, where the court of Denmark is there and Hamlet is outside that court. So the situation is reversed. Now, the reason why it takes Hamlet so long to kill Claudius is that if he simply killed him, I mean, there would be two things. First of all, this would be the shortest Elizabethan revenge tragedy that we would have on record, because he'd have done so at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 2, or certainly by Act 1, Scene 4, right? It has to be something that is a direct response to the public exposure of Claudius's crime. And when he kills him, he is actually, if you like, a representative of the figure of the state. And he cannot kill Claudius until he understands that. And the whole business with the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern letter, that's the kind of sea change that Hamlet undergoes. And by the time he comes back, and he has that discussion in Act 5, Scene 2 with Horatio, he's come to terms with the situation in which he finds himself, right? He can only respond given the opportunity that Providence provides. And it's only when Claudius publicly is exposed. Remember, he's not publicly exposed after the mousetrap scene. We know what's going on. Hamlet knows what's going on, but the audience, and certainly the stage audience, doesn't know what's going on. Okay? So it's not conclusive. This has to be something that's conclusive. And the thing is, it's at this point that revenge as a wild justice is recuperated for, if you like, the institution of justice. Claudius is now being punished for the crime of regicide that he's committed, and of course for all of the other crimes that have emerged from it. Now the question is, what about the poisoning of Hamlet? That in a sense is inadvertent, but on the other hand, there's a kind of tacit recognition here that even the act of just killing, or killing as an act of justice, that even this has certain question marks over it, right? In other words, officially sanctioned violence by the state is not quite as clear cut as it would appear. And that's how the play leaves us. Hamlet would have been a good king had he been allowed to continue. That's Fortinbras's judgment of him, right? So I think the thing is, we need to look at revenge as wild justice on the one hand, and then a kind of official version of it, which is, of course, the law and the punishment that the law enacts on criminals. And bear in mind, of course, in 1600, the kind of law enacted on criminals would have been pretty severe. Does that answer your question? No?
I guess so, sir.
You guess so. Okay. Next one.
Okay, sir. This is a question from Sonia. Why do you think revenge is mostly articulated through the medium of ghosts and Gothic narratives? We see this happening a lot in Elizabethan and pre-Elizabethan narratives. The Gothic and the ghostly seem almost archetypal in its suitability for articulating revenge stories.
Well, I think the thing about revenge is that it only seems to come up when there is some doubt or some question about the operations of, should we say, the law or justice. Yeah. Revenge requires a kind of balancing act. Somebody commits a crime and somebody then requires retribution. And of course, what happens is that the state intervenes. And the Elizabethan state was quite sophisticated in terms of, its judicial procedures. I think that the Gothic element really has to do with the energy that's released by revenge, the demonic energy that's released by revenge. And you can see that in a figure like Othello, where, his dedication to revenge is positively frightening, I think, where, passion completely swamps reason. There is an element, in the Gothic, there is an element, this kind of subterranean, frightening energy that if it's allowed to come to the surface, will actually destroy everything. And I think that's and it's only when attitudes towards the law are changing, or when society is in a state of transition, that these issues are brought to the fore. Because a number of revenge plays really start from the assumption that justice cannot be got. If you think about the revenges, the Spanish tragedy, Hieronymo is charged with dispensing justice. And yet, of course, he's unable to dispense justice for the murder of his own son. And it's that sends him mad. It's that rips him apart. Okay, next one.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question is from Vimal Mohinjan. The question is, although Hamlet's tragic flaw is often attributed to his inability to committing action to his promise, can he really be accused of being inactive? I have come across arguments that claim that he is raging inside, oscillating wildly within his own mind, contemplating, debating, and philosophizing. In that sense, perhaps the tragedy and the drive for revenge comes from the failure of language itself, doesn't it?
Okay, that last part of the sentence I agree with absolutely. A failure of language. Let's take up this issue of the tragic flaw. It's a kind of misrepresentation of what Aristotle says in the Poetics. The flaw is not a psychological flaw. We've made it that. And I suppose it's largely as a result of thinking about tragic action within the context of the novel, as it were, where, you know, individual agents have their own internal motivations for action. Hamlet here is forced to confront a reality that is shifting. That opening speech of Claudius in Act 1, Scene 2 is a very clever piece of rhetoric, very clever piece of rhetoric. And what it does, of course, is to attempt to enlist in a kind of demagogic manner that recent world events have brought to our attention. But, it's an attempt to appeal to everybody. Nor have we herein, he says to his court audience, herein barred your better wisdoms, which in all have freely gone with us along. You know, you've acknowledged the death of old Hamlet. You've acknowledged my wedding to Gertrude. You're all part of it, as it were. Okay, and of course, if you look at the structure of that speech, there's something very, very fishy about it. And of course, Claudius is guilty right the way throughout of forcing a division between what we used to call appearance and reality. The prayer scene, I think, is a classic case in point there, and certainly the final couplet: my words fly up, my thoughts remain below, words without thoughts never to heaven go. You know, if you detach words, if you detach language from reality, you end up in a kind of pathological fantasy world. And this is the world that Claudius inhabits. And it's the world that Hamlet is forced to confront. And he has to work that out. You know, he has to work out what's going on in this world before he can perform any other action. Because it's not the action that he performs, it's also how his action will be perceived. If he responds immediately, he ends up like Laertes, you know, vows to the blackest devil, etc., conscience to the pit, you know, all of that. Hamlet can't afford that. You know, that's not part of, what the ghost has asked him to do. But he has to figure out this. And this is why, of course, his ruminations, his meditations become philosophical. You know, they reach deeply down into the nature of Hamlet's being. And I think, you know, this business of Hamlet's hesitancy, we need to look at very carefully. I mean, because if we think that Hamlet is being hesitant, then what we want him to do is to act earlier. If we want him to act earlier, then we end up in the rebellious position of Laertes. And that's not what the play is advancing here. I mean, there is another element, of course, and this is what Claudius exposes. And we've had a recent example of this in events in the United States, where, there is now a challenge to the very nature of democracy itself, because you have somebody who is undemocratic, who seeks to expose and take advantage of the institutions that everybody for a long time has thought, were substantive. when Claudius says there is a divinity that doth hedge the king, the treason can but peep to what it would, acts little of his will, he's effectively invoking what was an ideological norm. You know, it's this that protects the king from acts of rebellion. Now, the question is, has it protected old Hamlet? Well, the answer is no. Therefore, of course, that ideological claim is open to abuse and will always be open to abuse so long as you have duplicitous figures like Claudius. So, you know, there's a sense in which even though the play ends in terms, you know, its aesthetic is conservative, when you brush the play against the grain, you find that it exposes the weak points of the very ideology that at times it articulates. Okay, so I would say we need to move aside from issues of, you know, Hamlet's delay and Hamlet's tragic flaw. He doesn't get punished at the end for his tragic flaw because he doesn't have one. And the idea that somehow Hamlet is a real person, I think it's Coleridge who says, I have a smack of Hamlet in me. Well, if I'd have been one of Coleridge's contemporaries, I think I'd have been very worried if he'd said that to me. You know, Hamlet is not a real person in that sense. He is a dramatis persona. And the structure of this play is very careful. It doubles actions, it expands actions, it modifies them. And it requires us, I think, to pay attention to that. So it requires, I think, you know, a pretty complex act of listening, which indicates that Elizabethan audiences weren't stupid. In fact, they would have been able to twig to pick up these issues. Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now, the next question is from Neka Fatima. There are examples of xenophobia and othering in all the tragedies discussed today. Can you elaborate a bit on that? As it were a very revolutionary thing to make a Moor a hero.
Yeah, xenophobia. Yes, I think so. I think that there are a lot of things that would make us uncomfortable. I think misogyny, xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, all of these things, they're there. In Othello, you can't get away from it. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that really Othello is a revenge play and we ought to forget about the question of racism and all the rest of it. Quite the reverse. In fact, the revenge elements kind of key into what are in fact racist elements. And that really what we need to look at in the case of Othello, and of course the earlier play, which is very closely connected with it, The Merchant of Venice, is a radical critique of Venice, you know, a radical critique of Venetian values. But, of course, it always makes English auditors look smug by comparison. And yet, of course, there were laws, you know, sort of governing the appearance of blacks in England. There were certainly elements of xenophobia operating, I think, you know, and in a sense, Elizabethan England created its own image of barbarism, you know, its civilization, and what it excludes is the barbaric. In this case, of course, it's the Venetian and the Turk. So, you know, I mean, I don't apologize for that. That's just what these plays are. And I think it's up to us to you know, sort of expose them. I mean, I don't think that Shakespeare is a kind of, you know, liberal in this respect. I think he goes along in many ways with the prejudices of his culture. But the one thing I would say is that Shakespeare very often gives a voice to those whom he excludes. You know, I mean, Shylock is given some very eloquent speeches. that would in fact be very critical of the Venetians. And what we then have to do is to rethink our notion of what Venice is. Then in Othello, I mean, if you bring together, you know, a kind of defender of Venetian values on the one hand, who, you know, internally speaking, is shall we say, noble and all the rest of it. But then, of course, you give him a black face, and where blackness in Elizabethan culture is the badge of hell. You know, I mean, I think that, you know, parts of the discourse of modern racism, particularly when it deals with questions of physical appearance, still has that sort of residual, you know, sort of negative attitude that's very difficult, I think, for some people to overcome. You know, I mean, we notice in this upsurge of xenophobia in, you know, Anglo-American culture. And the response is the whole Black Lives Matter movement. And then with feminism, the Me Too movement, you know. These are people who feel disenfranchised in some way. Now, in the case of Shakespeare's play, Othello is not disenfranchised. He's actually a defender of the state. But of course, the state itself contains forces that are potentially disruptive. And Iago, of course, is a representative of those forces. And it's interesting to see how the prejudices that he promulgates spread, and they actually infect the inner being of the eponymous hero. You know, Othello tries to kill a Turk. He tries to kill the Turkish adversary, but the Turkish adversary is himself. So there's this split between good and evil here, which in a way rather reinforces racial stereotyping. Again, we should be very careful with this. We should be very careful with this. We can't excuse it. I think we have to call it out for what it is. Okay? Next.
Okay, sir. On a related note, we have a question from Professor Josie Joseph. The question is, my question is about the last argument you presented about the racial tension underlying the Venetian society and polity. It is manifested in the climatic spectacle of the deaths of Desdemona and Othello, a black Moor with a suspect identity credentials killing a white European Christian lady and then committing suicide. Could you please elaborate on this? How about analyzing this in the light of such Derridean notion as